The Galactic Council's Grand Assembly Hall stretched beyond what most species could comfortably perceive, its crystalline walls designed to accommodate everything from the gaseous ethereals to the silicon-based rocklings. Today, like most days, it buzzed with the controlled chaos of interstellar politics. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered in their designated atmospheric zones, their translators humming with dozens of languages, while holographic displays showed trade routes, territorial disputes, and the endless minutiae of managing a civilization that spanned half the known universe. Commander Zarath of the Veltar hegemony stood at the center of it all, her forearms spread wide in a gesture that her species used to display dominance. She was impressive even by galactic standards. Nearly 3 meters tall, with chitinous armor that gleamed like polished obsidian, and compound eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously. Her people were apex predators from a world where the gravity was twice Earth normal, and the native fauna made most species' nightmares look like children's bedtime stories. The Phyrexian campaign lasted barely a cycle, Zarath was saying, her voice carrying easily across the assembly through the translation matrix. Their so-called warrior caste fled before my ships even entered their system. Pathetic creatures from their pathetic death world, cowering like hatchlings when faced with true predators. Several representatives nodded approvingly. The Phyrexians had been a problem for decades, raiding shipping lanes with their primitive but effective tactics. That the Veltar had dealt with them so efficiently was impressive, even if Zarath's methods were questionable by galactic standards. The Korathi collective was more amusing, she continued, her mandibles clicking in what passed for laughter among her kind. They actually tried to board my flagship? Can you imagine? These creatures from their frozen wasteland, thinking they could match Veltar warriors in close combat. I personally dismembered their warchief with my bare claws. The rest surrendered immediately. The assembly was growing uncomfortable now. Several species were shifting in their environmental chambers, and the ethereal's gaseous forms were swirling in patterns that indicated distress, but Zarath was just getting started. Then there were the Zephyrians, she said, her voice taking on a tone of genuine pleasure. Now those were true Deathworlders. Their world is nothing but storms and acid rain, and they've been fighting each other for millennia. When we arrived, they actually welcomed the challenge. Brave, for insects. Ambassador Kelthor of the Aquatic Coalition made a sound like grinding coral. Commander, perhaps we could discuss the terms of... I'm not finished, Zarath snapped, her head swiveling toward the water-filled chamber where Kelthor floated. The Zephyrians were beautiful fighters, fast, vicious, completely without fear. They threw themselves at my forces with such enthusiasm that I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. When the last Hive warrior fell, I took his wing blades as a trophy. Would you like to see them? She reached behind her back and drew forth a pair of crystalline weapons that seemed to bend light around their edges. Several representatives gasped, and more than a few security drones hummed to life. Magnificent craftsmanship, Zarath said, examining the blades with obvious appreciation. It's a shame their creators were too weak to keep them. But that's the way of Deathworlders, isn't it? All that evolution, all that natural selection, and in the end, they're still just prey when they meet a true apex species. The assembly hall had grown very quiet now. Most species in the galaxy had some experience with Deathworlders, worlds where the environment was so hostile that it produced species of unusual toughness and aggression. Many of the galaxy's finest soldiers and mercenaries came from such worlds, and they were generally treated with a mixture of respect and caution. The Drakmari were the most disappointing, Zarath continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension in the room. For a species that evolved in lava tubes and feeds on molten rock, they certainly died easily enough. Their famous berserker rage lasted all of 30 seconds against proper military tactics. I have 17 of their skulls mounted in my personal quarters. The largest one makes an excellent drinking cup. Ambassador Tel Quinn of the Peaceful Traders Alliance stood up in her environmental suit. Her photosynthetic skin flushed a deep orange that indicated extreme agitation. Commander Zarathoth, the Council cannot condone these atrocities. The targeting of civilian populations, the taking of trophies from the dead. Atrocities? Zarath's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. I prefer to call them object lessons. The galaxy needed to understand that Deathworlders aren't the bogeymen they pretend to be. Strip away their environmental advantages, face them with superior technology and tactics, and they die just like any other species. Perhaps more slowly, which I admit has its entertainment value. She began to pace now, her claws clicking against the crystal floor with each step. The sound echoed through the chamber like a countdown timer. The ravages of Cathmore lasted the longest, she said. 3 whole days. 3 days of their famous last stands and death before dishonor. By the end, they were begging for mercy in 12 different languages. I was almost tempted to grant it, but then I remembered how their raids had terrorized the outer colonies for decades. Justice has a price, and I was happy to collect it. Several ambassadors were already transmitting urgent messages to their homeworlds. The Veltar hegemony was a major military power, but they were also notoriously unstable. If Zarathus was representative of their current military thinking, it could mean trouble for everyone. But my personal favorite, Zarathus said, her compound eyes gleaming, were the Voidstalkers of the Maelstrom Nebula. Now those were apex predators. Born in zero gravity, evolved to hunt in 3 dimensions, with reflexes that could make them invisible to most optical sensors. They'd been terrorizing shipping in that sector for centuries, and no one had been able to stop them. She paused dramatically, clearly enjoying the attention. It took me less than a week to exterminate them completely. Every last nest, every breeding female, every egg cluster. The nebula is safe for commerce now, thanks to my efforts. The Merchants Guild should be grateful, though I notice my fee is still pending. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual background hum of the environmental system seemed muted. Representatives stared at Zarath with expressions ranging from horror to disgust, while security drones hovered closer to the assembly floor. It was into this silence that a new voice spoke. Did any of them hunt you back? The question was asked in perfectly calm galactic standard, with no emotional inflection whatsoever. It took several seconds for the translation matrix to process it and relay it to the various atmospheric chambers, and several more seconds for the assembled representatives to locate its source. In the observation gallery normally reserved for junior diplomats and visiting scholars, a single figure sat alone. She was small by galactic standards, barely 1.5 meters tall, and appeared to be completely unremarkable. Her skin was the pale brown color common to several dozen species. Her hair was a nondescript dark shade, and her clothing was the standard-issue grey uniform of a research assistant or low-level bureaucrat. The only unusual thing about her was how utterly still she sat, not the artificial stillness of meditation or the forced stillness of fear, but the natural, relaxed stillness of something that had no need to move because it was already exactly where it needed to be. Zaratha turned to look at the gallery, her head tilting in a gesture that indicated confusion. "I beg your pardon." The figure in the gallery stood up with fluid grace and began walking toward the rail that separated the observation area from the main floor. As she moved, several things became apparent. Her gait was perfectly balanced, each step placed with unconscious precision. Her breathing was so controlled it was barely visible. And her eyes were the flat, patient eyes of something that had spent a very long time learning how to wait. "I asked," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chamber, "if any of them hunted you back." Zarath's mandibles clicked in annoyance. "Who are you to question Dr. Sarah Chen," the figure said, still moving with that same unhurried pace. "Cultural anthropologist, University of New Geneva. I'm here studying apex predator societies and their interaction with Deathworld ecosystems. Your presentation has been illuminating." She reached the rail and placed her hands on it with casual familiarity. Up close, the assembled representatives could see that her hands were scarred, not dramatically, but with the sort of small, regular marks that came from a lifetime of working with sharp tools and rough surfaces. "I notice you didn't answer my question," Sarah Chen said. Zarath drew herself up to her full height, looming over the human female like a tower of living armor. "Your question is irrelevant. Prey does not hunt predators, doesn't it?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, and for just a moment something shifted in her eyes. Something cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. "See, that's interesting. Because where I come from, we have this saying, the most dangerous predator is the one that used to be prey." The assembly hall had become so quiet that the sound of environmental systems was clearly audible. Representatives leaned forward in their chambers, suddenly very interested in this unexpected development. "Your species?" Zarath asked, and there was something new in her voice now, something that might have been uncertainty. "Human," Sarah said simply. "From a little death world called Earth. Maybe you've heard of it." Zarath's compound eyes widened slightly. She had heard of it, of course. Everyone had. Earth was legendary even among Deathworlders, a planet so hostile that it had produced not just one apex predator species, but dozens. Most of them had gone extinct, leaving only humans to inherit a world that seemed designed to kill everything that lived on it. But humans were supposed to be peaceful, diplomatic. They ran universities and research stations, served as mediators and cultural liaisons. They were scientists and explorers, not warriors. Weren't they? Tell me, Commander, Sarah said. And now there was something else in her voice. Something that made the temperature in the chamber seem to drop several degrees. When you hunted these Deathworlders, did you do it personally? Or did you just order your fleets to bombard them from orbit? I fought them personally, Zarath said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I led the boarding parties against the Phyrexian dreadnoughts. I commanded the ground assault on the Korathi homeworld. But did you hunt them? Sarah asked, and the question cut through Zarath's words like a blade. Did you track them through their native environment? Did you learn their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses? Did you become part of their ecosystem, study their behavior, understand not just how to kill them, but how to become them? The silence stretched out like a held breath. Because that's what hunting is, Sarah continued, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. It's not about superior technology or overwhelming force. Any idiot with a big enough gun can kill something. Hunting is about patience. It's about understanding your prey better than it understands itself. It's about becoming invisible not just to their senses, but to their expectations. She paused, her eyes fixed on Zarath with the sort of attention that a scientist might give to a particularly interesting specimen. It's about making them realize that they were never the predator at all. The silence that followed Sarah's words stretched through the assembly hall like a living thing. Representatives who had been shifting uncomfortably in their environmental chambers now sat perfectly still, as if afraid that any movement might draw attention to themselves. Even the security drones seemed to hover with unusual quietness. Zaratha stared down at the human female, her compound eyes reflecting the chamber's ambient light in thousands of tiny fragments. For the first time since she had begun her boastful recitation, she seemed to be at a loss for words. I don't understand your meaning, she said finally. But there was a careful quality to her voice now that hadn't been there before. Sarah smiled, and it was a perfectly pleasant expression that somehow made several representatives unconsciously lean away from their viewing screens. Oh, I think you do. You see, Commander, I've been studying your campaigns very thoroughly. The Phyrexian assault, the Korathi invasion, the systematic extermination of the Voidstalkers. Fascinating work, from a tactical perspective. She began to pace along the rail, her movement fluid and controlled. As she walked, she spoke with the calm precision of an academic delivering a lecture. The Phyrexian campaign, for instance, your reports indicate that their fleet scattered before you even reached their system. But what the reports don't mention is that Phyrexian naval doctrine has always been based on mobile defense. They deliberately withdrew to draw you into the asteroid fields where their smaller ships would have the advantage. It's a strategy they've used successfully for over 2 centuries. Zarath's mandibles clicked once, sharply. They withdrew because they were cowards. They withdrew, Sarah continued without pause, because it was the tactically sound decision. But you didn't follow them into the asteroids, did you? You bypassed the fleet entirely and went straight for their homeworld, bombarded their cities from orbit until they had no choice but to recall their ships to defend their families. The human's voice remained perfectly level, but something in her tone made the words sound like an accusation. Very efficient, Sarah said. Not hunting, of course. More like pest control. Ambassador Kelthor made a sound like grinding coral. Dr. Chen, perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue for... Oh, but it is, Sarah said, turning toward the Aquatic Coalition's chamber with that same pleasant smile. You see, Commander Zarath has been kind enough to provide us with a comprehensive case study in predator behavior. It would be a waste not to analyze it properly. She turned back to face Zarath, who had drawn herself up to her full height in an obvious attempt to intimidate the much smaller human. The Korathi Collective was even more instructive, Sarah continued. A species that evolved in sub-zero temperatures, with natural armor that can stop projectile weapons and reflexes, honed by millennia of hunting ice whales in 3-dimensional underwater environments. Their war chief was probably one of the most dangerous close combat fighters in known space. Was, Zarath said with satisfaction. I killed him myself. Yes, you did, Sarah agreed. After your boarding parties flooded their ship with neurotoxin gas, the same neurotoxin that your species is naturally immune to, but which causes paralysis in most carbon-based life forms. He couldn't even move when you had fought him, could he? The assembly hall was so quiet now that the sound of Zarath's breathing was clearly audible. Her chest plates were rising and falling with increasing rapidity, and the tips of her claws had begun to extend from their sheaths. Tactics, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Any competent commander uses every available advantage. Absolutely, Sarah said. But let's call it what it is. You poisoned him and then dismembered a paralyzed opponent. That's not combat, Commander. That's butchery. Several representatives made sounds of distress or disgust, but Sarah's attention remained fixed on Zaratha with the sort of focus that a biologist might apply to a dissection. The Zephyrians were particularly tragic, she continued. A species that had achieved a level of aerial combat proficiency that most military analysts considered theoretically impossible. Their wing blade techniques were studied in military academies across the galaxy. And yet, according to your reports, they threw themselves at your forces with enthusiasm. Why do you suppose they did that? Zaratha's compound eyes narrowed. They were primitives. They thought courage could overcome superior technology. They were protecting their breeding grounds, Sarah said flatly. Your forces had positioned themselves directly over their nesting sites. Every suicidal charge was actually a desperate attempt to draw your fire away from their young. They knew they couldn't win, but they kept attacking anyway because every second they delayed you was another few dozen larvae that might escape to the deep caves. The human paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had taken on a quality that made the environmental controls seem inadequate. They died buying time for their children to live, and you took their wing blades as trophies. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of translation matrices as various species processed the implications of what they had heard. Several representatives were already updating their files on both the Veltar hegemony and the species called human. The Drakmari campaign was perhaps the most revealing, Sarah continued, and now she was moving with the sort of controlled precision that predators used when stalking prey. A species that had never lost a ground engagement in recorded history. Berserkers who could fight for days without rest and who treated death in battle as the highest honor. And yet they died easily when faced with your forces. She stopped pacing and turned to face Zarath directly. Tell me, Commander, what's the atmospheric composition of the Drakmarai homeworld? Zarath's head tilted in confusion. Irrelevant. Standard atmospheric controls. 93% nitrogen, 6% sulfur dioxide, trace methane, Sarah said. The Drakmari require sulfur compounds to maintain their metabolic processes. Without them, they experience rapid cellular breakdown. Their famous berserker rage is actually a desperate physiological response to metabolic failure. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. You didn't fight the Drakmari, Commander. You suffocated them, slowly. While they were dying, they tried to fight anyway, because that's what their culture demanded. But they weren't berserkers in that battle. They were just terrified creatures dying far from home, in an atmosphere they couldn't breathe. Zarath's claws were fully extended now, gleaming like polished metal in the chamber's light. You dare! And the ravages of Kethmore? Sarah continued, as if the Veltar hadn't spoken. 3 days of last stands and death before dishonor. Except Kethmore is a tidally locked world, isn't it? One side permanent day, the other permanent night, with the only habitable zone being the narrow twilight band between them. Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the translation matrix. You didn't conquer their cities, Commander. You destroyed their water supplies. For 3 days, you watched an entire civilization die of thirst while they tried to maintain their dignity. The begging for mercy in 12 different languages wasn't military surrender. It was parents pleading for water for their children. The sound Zarath made was unlike anything the translation matrix had processed before. It was part raw, part hiss, and entirely inhuman. Several representatives activated emergency barriers around their environmental chambers. Enough, Zarath snarled, her forearms spread wide in a gesture of absolute aggression. I will not be lectured by some insignificant prey species about the realities of warfare. Prey species? Sarah repeated.
And something in her voice made the temperature in the chamber seem to drop even further.
You know that's interesting, because I've been wondering, in all of these campaigns, all of these glorious victories against dangerous Deathworlders, did any of them ever turn the tables? Did any of them ever start hunting you? She began walking again, her pace unhurried but somehow predatory. Because that's what we do, you see, humans. When something hunts us, we study it. We learn everything there is to know about it. We find its weaknesses, its patterns, its habits, and then we become better at hunting it than it is at hunting us. Ambassador Telquin of the Peaceful Traders Alliance was frantically signaling for security intervention, but the drones seemed reluctant to approach the confrontation developing on the main floor. It's our evolutionary heritage. Sarah continued conversationally. We spent millions of years being prey for everything from saber-toothed cats to pack hunters that were stronger, faster, and better armed than we were. So we developed something they didn't have. She stopped walking and looked directly at Zarath. Patience. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. We learned to track wounded animals for days through terrain that would kill most species. We learned to anticipate their behavior so completely that we could predict where they would be before they knew it themselves. We learned to become invisible not just to their senses, but to their expectations. Zarath was breathing heavily now, her chest plates rising and falling with increasing rapidity. For the first time since entering the chamber, she seemed to be having difficulty maintaining her composure. We learned, Sarah said, and her voice had become something cold and terrible, that the most effective way to hunt a predator is to let it think it's hunting you. The assembly hall had become a tableau of frozen terror. Representatives sat motionless in their chambers. Security drones hovered at the edges of the room, their programming apparently unable to determine whether this conversation constituted a threat. "So I'll ask you again, Commander," Sarah said. And now there was no trace of academic politeness in her voice. "In all of your glorious campaigns against Deathworlders, did any of them ever hunt you back?" Zarath opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in her military career, she found herself face to face with something that her evolutionary programming couldn't categorize. The human female was small, obviously unarmed, and completely alone. By every instinct her species possessed, she should be prey. But predators didn't move like that. Predators didn't speak like that. And predators certainly didn't smile like that. "I thought not," Sarah said softly. "Because you see, Commander, you've never actually hunted anything in your life. You've killed plenty of things, certainly. You've destroyed civilizations, murdered families, committed genocide on a scale that would make most species violently ill to contemplate." She took a step closer to the rail that separated her from the main floor, and Zarath actually took a step backward. "But hunting? Real hunting? That requires understanding your prey, becoming part of their world, learning to think like them, move like them, anticipate their every action." Her smile widened, and it was the expression that would haunt the dreams of every representative present for years to come. It requires becoming what they fear most. The words hung in the air of the assembly hall like a challenge that no one dared to answer. Zarath stood frozen, her forearms slightly raised as if preparing for an attack that wasn't coming, while Sarah Chen remained perfectly still behind the observation gallery rail, her dark eyes reflecting the chamber's ambient light with predatory patience. "Dr. Chen," Ambassador Kelfor said finally, his coral-grinding voice carefully neutral, "while your analysis is illuminating, perhaps we should return to the original purpose of this assembly." Sarah's head turned toward the Aquatic Coalition's chamber with fluid precision. "Oh, but we are discussing the original purpose, Ambassador." Commander Zarath was sharing her experiences with Deathworlder species. I'm simply providing additional context. Her gaze shifted back to Zarath, who was still standing in the center of the main floor like a statue carved from living chitin. "Tell me, Commander, have you ever been to Earth?" The question seemed to break Zarath out of her paralysis. She straightened to her full height, her compound eyes reflecting tiny fragments of light as they focused on the human. "Earth is restricted," she said, her voice regaining some of its earlier arrogance. "Quarantined by council mandate after the incidents, with early contact protocols." "Ah, yes, the incidents," Sarah said, and her smile took on a quality that several representatives found deeply unsettling. "You mean when the first diplomatic missions mysteriously disappeared? When entire survey teams vanished without sending so much as a distress signal?" She began walking along the rail again, her movement casual but somehow predatory. 17 separate first contact missions over a period of 50 standard years. Ships from a dozen different species, all equipped with the most advanced surveillance and communication technology available. All gone without a trace. Zarath's mandibles clicked nervously. Primitive Deathworlders attacking superior technology. It happens. That's why Earth was quarantined. "Actually," Sarah said, stopping to lean against the rail with casual familiarity, "that's not why Earth was quarantined at all." "Would you like to know what really happened to those missions?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the environmental systems seemed to have quieted, as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. "The first ship was from the Altarian Confederacy," Sarah began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting from memory. "The ISV Prometheus. Beautiful ship, really. Crew of 43, all experts in xenobiology and first contact protocols. They arrived in Earth orbit on March 15, 2387, and sent their standard greeting transmission. She paused, her eyes distant as if she were remembering something from long ago. We responded, of course, welcomed them, invited them to establish diplomatic relations. They were so excited. First contact with a genuine death world species. The scientific opportunities were unprecedented. Zareth was listening now with the sort of attention that prey animals gave to unusual sounds in the darkness. The Prometheus crew spent 3 months in Earth's system, Sarah continued. They established orbital stations, sent down survey teams, collected biological samples. They were particularly fascinated by our predator species. Lions, tigers, great white sharks. They found it amazing that so many apex predators could evolve on a single world. Her smile widened slightly. They were even more amazed when they realized that humans weren't actually at the top of the food chain, that we were persistence hunters, predators who killed, not through strength or speed, but through sheer bloody-minded endurance. They documented everything, sent regular reports back to their homeworld, right up until the day they tried to leave. The assembly hall was so quiet that the sound of Zarath's breathing was clearly audible. Her chest plates were rising and falling with increasing rapidity. That's when they discovered that their navigation computer had been subtly altered, Sarah said conversationally. Nothing dramatic. Just small changes to their stellar cartography database. Adjustments to gravitational constants. Minor modifications to their jump drive calculations. She straightened up from the rail and began pacing again, her movement fluid and controlled. The Prometheus jumped for home on June 18th. They emerged from hyperspace 3 weeks later, in the middle of nowhere, 40 light-years from the nearest inhabited system. Their fuel reserves were depleted, their communication array was damaged, and their crew was beginning to panic. Several representatives were leaning forward in their environmental chambers now, caught up in the narrative despite themselves. It took them 6 months to jury-rig a communication system powerful enough to reach the nearest Altarian outpost. Sarah continued. When they finally made contact, their report was interesting. They claimed that Earth's primitive inhabitants had somehow sabotaged their ship, but they couldn't explain how. The evidence was subtle, sophisticated, and completely beyond the technological capabilities of a species that had barely achieved interstellar flight. She stopped pacing and turned to face Zarath directly. So, the Altarians sent another ship, the ISV Hermes. Faster, better armed, with a crew specifically trained in dealing with hostile natives. They arrived in Earth's system with full defensive protocols active and weapons ready. The smile never left Sarah's face, but something cold had crept into her eyes. We welcomed them too. The implications of those 4 words rippled through the assembly hall like a shockwave. Representatives began updating their files, cross-referencing historical records, and making urgent communications to their homeworlds. The Hermes lasted 2 weeks, Sarah said. They were much more cautious than the Prometheus crew. They kept their ship at maximum sensor range, never allowed more than minimal contact with Earth's surface, and maintained constant communication with their home base. She paused, allowing the silence to stretch, right up until their fusion reactors experienced a catastrophic containment failure. Very tragic. The explosion was visible from Earth's surface. Zarath made a sound like grinding metal. Sabotage. Impossible, Sarah said cheerfully. The Hermes crew never allowed any Earth natives aboard their ship. They maintained strict quarantine protocols. No physical contact, no exchange of materials, nothing that could have introduced sabotage devices or hostile organisms.
Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper.
Of course, they did accept our gifts. Cultural artifacts, works of art, scientific specimens. Standard diplomatic protocol. And we were so grateful for their interest in our primitive civilization. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of environmental systems cycling as various species adjusted their atmospheric controls in what appeared to be nervous responses. 15 more ships over the next 47 years? Sarah continued conversationally. Each one more advanced than the last. Each one convinced that they had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. The Zephyrian exploration vessel that suffered a computer virus that made their artificial gravity fluctuate randomly until the crew went insane. The Karathi dreadnought that experienced a peculiar form of metal fatigue that caused their hull to split open in the vacuum of space. The Veltar heavy cruiser that... There were no Veltar ships! Zarath snarled, her claws fully extended and gleaming in the chamber's light. Sarah tilted her head with the curious expression of someone examining an interesting specimen. Weren't they? The VHS domination, Captain Krilltak commanding. Beautiful ship, really. Your people built it specifically for operations in hostile environments. Triple armored hull, redundant life support systems, enough firepower to level a small continent. Her voice took on a tone of academic appreciation. It arrived in Earth's system 53 years ago with orders to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of Earth's military potential. No diplomatic niceties, no cultural exchange. Just pure intelligence gathering. Very efficient. Zarath's compound eyes had gone very still, which was usually a sign that a Veltar was preparing for violence. The Domination spent 6 weeks mapping Earth's defenses, Sarah continued. Such as they were. A few orbital stations, some primitive missile batteries, nothing that could threaten a proper warship. Captain Kreltak was particularly amused by our fleet, a handful of chemical propulsion vessels that could barely reach their own moon. She began walking again, her pace unhurried but somehow inexorable. Then the Domination developed a problem with their waste processing systems. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual buildup of toxic compounds in their air recycling units. The crew started getting sick. Headaches at first, then nausea, then hallucinations. Sarah's smile widened. They tried to fix it, of course. Brought in their best engineers, replaced entire sections of the system, even considered returning to their home base for repairs. But the problem kept getting worse. The crew was becoming increasingly irrational, paranoid, violent. She stopped pacing and looked directly at Zarath. By the time they figured out that someone had introduced a genetically modified bacteria into their life support systems, it was too late. The crew was already dead. The ship drifted for 3 months before your people found it. The assembly hall had become a tableau of frozen horror. Representatives sat motionless in their environmental chambers, afraid to move or speak. Even the security drones seemed to hover with unusual stillness. Of course, Sarah continued conversationally, that's when your people implemented the quarantine. Very sensible decision, really. Earth was obviously too dangerous for direct contact. Better to observe from a distance and wait for the native population to develop more advanced technology. She straightened up and brushed an invisible speck of dust from her uniform. Which brings us to the present day. Humanity has developed interstellar flight, established diplomatic relations with dozens of species, joined the Galactic Council as a junior member. We've proven ourselves to be peaceful, diplomatic, scientifically minded, perfect galactic citizens. Her eyes fixed on Zarath with laser intensity, except for one small detail that most people seem to have overlooked. The silence stretched out like a held breath. In the 73 years since the quarantine was established, not one ship has ever successfully conducted hostile operations against Earth. Not one invasion force has ever reached our system. Not one military reconnaissance mission has ever returned with actionable intelligence. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had taken on a quality that made the environmental controls seem inadequate. Now why do you suppose that is, Commander? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over the assembly. Zaratha stood frozen in the center of the chamber, her compound eyes reflecting the ambient light in thousands of tiny fragments, while Sarah Chen remained perfectly still behind the observation rail, her dark eyes fixed on the Veltar commander with predatory patience. I think, Sarah said softly, that you're beginning to understand. She vaulted over the rail with fluid grace, landing on the main floor of the assembly hall with barely a sound. Several representatives activated emergency barriers around their environmental chambers, while security drones began moving closer to the confrontation. You see, Commander, Sarah continued, walking slowly across the crystalline floor towards Zarath, you've been operating under a fundamental misconception about humans. About Deathworlders in general, really, but humans in particular. Her pace was unhurried, almost casual, but there was something in her movement that made Zarath's evolutionary instincts scream warnings. The Veltar commander found herself backing away without conscious thought, her claws extending and retracting in nervous patterns. You think we're primitive, Sarah said, her voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. Violent but crude. Dangerous in the same way that a wounded animal is dangerous. Unpredictable, desperate, but ultimately manageable with superior technology and tactics. She stopped walking, just outside of what most species would consider comfortable conversation distance. For humans it was perfectly normal. For Veltar it was uncomfortably close to combat range. But you missed something crucial in your analysis, Sarah continued. Something that every predator species learns eventually, usually right before it goes extinct. Zarath's breathing had become rapid and shallow, her chest plates rising and falling with increasing frequency. What? She managed to ask. Sarah's smile was gentle, almost friendly. Persistence hunters don't just outlast their prey, they outlast their competition. The words seemed to echo through the chamber with unusual resonance. Representatives leaned forward in their environmental chambers, caught between fascination and terror. Do you know how many apex predator species existed on Earth when humans first developed tool use? Sarah asked conversationally. Hundreds. Cave bears, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant hyenas. Creatures that were stronger, faster, better armed than early humans could ever hope to be. She began circling Zareth now, her movement fluid and controlled. The Veltar commander tried to rotate to keep the human in sight, but Sarah moved with the sort of effortless grace that suggested she could change direction without warning. Do you know how many of them are still alive? The silence that followed was deafening. None, Sarah said simply. We outlasted them all, not by fighting them directly. That would have been suicide. But by being more adaptable, more persistent, more willing to change our tactics when the old ones stopped working. She stopped circling and stood directly in front of Zariatha, her hands clasped behind her back in a pose that suggested academic contemplation. We learned to think like them, to predict their behavior, to understand their weaknesses better than they understood them themselves. And then we became better at being them than they were. Zarath's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation among her species. This is meaningless philosophical speculation. Is it? Sarah interrupted, and something in her voice made the temperature in the chamber seem to drop several degrees. Tell me, Commander, what do you know about human military doctrine? The question caught Zarath off guard. Irrelevant. Humans avoid direct military confrontation. Your species prefers diplomacy. Our current species prefers diplomacy, Sarah corrected gently. The previous version was somewhat less accommodating. You might have heard of them. Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. Stronger than modern humans. Tougher. Better adapted to harsh environments. Natural warriors. Her smile widened slightly. They went extinct about 40,000 years ago. Completely displaced by a physically weaker, less specialized subspecies that had developed one critical advantage. She tapped her temple with one finger. Pattern recognition. The ability to observe, analyze, and adapt to changing circumstances faster than the competition could respond. The assembly hall had become so quiet that the sound of environmental systems was clearly audible. Representatives sat motionless in their chambers, afraid to draw attention to themselves. Modern human military doctrine, Sarah continued, is built around a very simple principle: never fight fair. If the enemy is stronger, be faster. If they're faster, be smarter. If they're smarter, be more patient. Always adapt, always evolve, always become what they least expect. She began walking again, her pace measured and deliberate. Take the Phyrexian campaign, for example. You attacked their homeworld to force their fleet to return and defend their families. Classic intimidation tactics threaten what they value most to make them behave irrationally. Zarath's head tilted slightly. Effective tactics? For most species, yes, Sarah agreed. But if you had been fighting humans, you would have discovered something interesting. We don't respond to threats the way other species do. Her voice took on the cadence of someone delivering a lecture. When humans are threatened, we don't panic. We don't make emotional decisions. We analyze the threat, identify the source, and then we systematically eliminate it. Not just the immediate threat, the entire chain of command that authorized it. She stopped walking and turned to face Zarath directly. If you had threatened human families, Commander, you wouldn't have found yourself fighting a demoralized fleet trying to protect their homeworld. You would have found yourself being hunted by every human military unit within 100 light years. Not to capture you, not to negotiate with you, but to ensure that you and everyone who gave you orders ceased to exist. The implications of her words rippled through the assembly hall like a shockwave. Several representatives began frantically updating their files on human military capabilities. The Karathi war chief was impressive, Sarah continued conversationally. Probably could have defeated any 3 humans in single combat under normal circumstances. But you didn't fight him under normal circumstances, did you? You poisoned him first. Zarath's claws clicked against the crystalline floor. Sound tactics. Oh, absolutely, Sarah agreed. But you see, that's exactly what humans would have done. We've been using poison in warfare for thousands of years. Biological weapons, chemical agents, toxins derived from everything from plant alkaloids to synthetic compounds. We're very good at it. Her smile took on a quality that several representatives found deeply disturbing. The difference is, we don't consider it dishonorable. We consider it efficient. And when someone uses our own tactics against us, we don't get angry, we get impressed. And then we figure out how to do it better. She began circling Zaroth again, her movement predatory and controlled. The Zephyrians were protecting their young, she said. Noble from a certain perspective, tragically futile from a tactical one. But you missed the real lesson there, Commander. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They kept fighting even when they knew they couldn't win. Even when survival was impossible, they continued to resist. That's not stupidity, that's evolutionary programming. It's what produces species capable of surviving on Deathworlds. She stopped directly behind Zarathus, close enough that the Veltar could feel her body heat. And it's what makes them dangerous even after they're defeated. Because Deathworlders don't just fight to win. They fight to make the cost of victory too high to be worthwhile. Zaroth spun around, her forearms spread wide in a defensive posture. But Sarah had already moved. She was now standing several meters away, her hands clasped behind her back, looking for all the world like a professor delivering a lecture to a particularly slow student. Which brings us to the most important lesson of all, Sarah said. The one that I think you're finally beginning to understand. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Humans don't hunt other species, Commander. We hunt other hunters. The words echoed through the vast space with terrible clarity. Representatives stared at their viewing screens in horrified fascination, while security drones hovered at the edges of the chamber, their programming apparently unable to determine whether this conversation constituted a threat. Every apex predator that ever threatened humanity has learned the same lesson, Sarah continued, her voice calm and conversational. We study them until we understand them better than they understand themselves. We learn their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. We become invisible to their senses and their expectations. She began walking towards Zaroth again, her pace unhurried but inexorable. And then, when they least expect it, we become the thing they fear most. Zaroth had tried to back away, but found herself pressed against the curved wall of the assembly chamber. Her compound eyes darted left and right, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. The Drakmarie Berserkers, the Void Stalkers of the Maelstrom Nebula, the Ravagers of Kethmore, Sarah said, counting off on her fingers. All apex predators, all species that had never lost a military engagement in recorded history, all eliminated by Veltar forces using tactics that were sophisticated, efficient, and completely ruthless. She stopped just outside of arm's reach, her dark eyes fixed on Zaroth with laser intensity. Tactics that were also completely human in their conception and execution. The implications hit the assembly hall like a physical force. Representatives began frantically accessing historical databases, cross-referencing military records, updating threat assessments. The patterns were there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. You see, Commander, Sarah said softly, you've never actually fought a Deathworlder in your life. You've been fighting with Deathworlder tactics, using Deathworlder strategies, following Deathworlder military doctrine. Her smile was gentle, almost apologetic. You've been hunting with human methods this entire time. The only question remaining is whether you're smart enough to realize what that means. The realization hit Zaroth like a physical blow. Her compound eyes widened to their maximum extent, reflecting the chamber's light in thousands of tiny, terrified fragments. For the first time in her military career, she found herself face to face with a truth that her evolutionary programming couldn't process. She wasn't the predator. She had never been the predator. I can see you're beginning to understand, Sarah said gently, her voice carrying the sort of patience that a teacher might use with a particularly slow student. It's always difficult when prey species realize what they actually are. The assembly hall had become a tableau of frozen horror. Representatives sat motionless in their environmental chambers, their various forms of breathing apparatus working overtime as they processed the implications of what they were hearing. Security drones hovered at the edges of the room, their targeting systems unable to classify the small human female who had just redefined the nature of galactic warfare. The tactical analysis software, Sarah continued, beginning to pace around the paralyzed Veltar commander, very sophisticated. Capable of processing thousands of variables simultaneously, calculating optimal attack vectors, predicting enemy responses with remarkable accuracy. Where did your people acquire it? Zaroth's mandibles clicked rapidly, but no words came out. The psychological warfare techniques, Sarah pressed on, targeting civilian populations to demoralize military forces, using environmental weapons to exploit physiological weaknesses, breaking enemy morale through calculated brutality. These aren't traditional Veltar strategies, are they? The silence stretched out like a held breath. The intelligence networks that allowed you to identify the perfect targets, Sarah said, her voice growing softer and more dangerous with each word. Species that were isolated, vulnerable, lacking in political connections that might bring retaliation. How did you know which Deathworlders were safe to attack? She stopped pacing and turned to face Zarath directly. Someone's been helping you, Commander. Someone with access to detailed psychological profiles of multiple species, advanced tactical analysis capabilities, and comprehensive intelligence on galactic political structures. Someone who wanted those specific Deathworlder populations eliminated, and who was willing to use the Veltar hegemony as a weapon to accomplish it. The implications rippled through the assembly hall like a shockwave. Representatives began frantically accessing secure communication channels, updating threat assessments, and reconsidering their understanding of galactic politics. But here's the truly elegant part, Sarah continued, her smile taking on a quality that would haunt the dreams of everyone present for years to come. Whoever's been guiding you made sure that your campaigns would serve multiple purposes. Eliminate dangerous Deathworlder populations, field test new military technologies, and create a comprehensive database of combat effectiveness against various species types. She began walking again, her movement fluid and predatory. In other words, Commander, you haven't been conducting military campaigns at all. You've been participating in a research project, a very thorough, very comprehensive study of how to most efficiently exterminate Deathworlder species. Zarath finally found her voice. That's impossible. The Veltar hegemony answers to no one. The Veltar hegemony, Sarah interrupted, has been acting as a proxy force for someone who wanted to test human military doctrine against the most dangerous species in known space. Someone who needed to understand our capabilities, our weaknesses, our tactical preferences, before attempting direct confrontation. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Someone who's been preparing for war with humanity for decades. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of environmental systems cycling, as various species adjusted their atmospheric controls in what appeared to be panic responses. The question now, Sarah said conversationally, is whether you're capable of recognizing what's about to happen. She stopped walking and clasped her hands behind her back, adopting the pose of an academic delivering a lecture. You see, Commander, the human approach to warfare is fundamentally different from most galactic species. When we identify a threat, we don't just neutralize it, we study it first. We learn everything there is to know about it, its capabilities, its methods, its weaknesses, its support structure. We've been studying the Veltar hegemony for quite some time now. Every tactical decision, every strategic choice, every operational parameter. Your campaigns against Deathworlder species have provided us with a comprehensive database of your military capabilities. Zarath's breathing had become rapid and shallow. You're bluffing.
Humans are peaceful.
Humans are adaptive, Sarah corrected. When faced with a threat, we become whatever we need to become to eliminate it.
Right now, we need to become better at being Veltar than the Veltar are. She began walking again, her pace measured and deliberate. Do you know what the primary weakness of apex predator species is, Commander? They're specialized. They've evolved to dominate specific environments, to hunt specific prey, to employ specific strategies. When those strategies stop working, they have difficulty adapting. Her voice took on the cadence of someone explaining a complex scientific principle. Persistence hunters, on the other hand, are generalists. We adapt to whatever environment we find ourselves in, hunt whatever prey is available, employ whatever strategies are most effective. When our current approach stops working, we simply change it. She stopped directly in front of Zaratha, close enough that the Veltar could smell the faint scent of something that might have been ozone or electrical discharge. We've already begun changing, Commander. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Phyrexian fleet that you scattered? Sarah said conversationally. They didn't flee in panic. They withdrew to predetermined coordinates where human naval units were waiting to study their tactics and technology. The survivors have been very helpful in developing countermeasures against Veltar assault strategies. Zarath made it sound like grinding metal. Impossible. We monitored all communications. You monitored the communications we wanted you to monitor, Sarah said patiently. The real coordination was handled through channels that don't rely on electromagnetic transmission, quantum entanglement networks primarily, very difficult to intercept or decode. Her smile took on a predatory quality. The Karathi war chief that you killed in single combat, he volunteered for that mission. Spent months in a human medical facility developing immunity to your neurotoxin compounds before infiltrating the boarding operation. The paralysis was temporary, a side effect of the countermeasures he'd been given. The assembly hall had become so quiet that the sound of Zarath's breathing was clearly audible.
He's currently serving as a tactical advisor to human special operations forces, Sarah continued.
His insights into Veltar close combat techniques have been invaluable in developing training protocols. She began circling the paralyzed Veltar commander again, her movement casual but somehow menacing. The Zephyrian wing blades that you took as trophies? They were gifts, specially prepared by master craftsmen who spent decades perfecting techniques for creating weapons that would function as tracking devices. Every time you handle them, they transmit detailed biometric data about Veltar physiology and combat responses. Zarath's compound eyes had gone very still, which was usually a sign that a Veltar was preparing for violence or experiencing complete system shutdown. The Drakmari skulls in your personal quarters make excellent listening devices, Sarah added helpfully. The bone structure resonates at precisely the right frequency to transmit audio signals across interstellar distances. Your private conversations have been most illuminating. The sound Zarath made was unlike anything the translation matrix had processed before. It was part raw, part keen, and entirely inhuman. And the ravages of Kethmore? Sarah continued, ignoring the alien sounds of distress. They didn't die of thirst, Commander. They died of a genetically engineered pathogen that was designed to be undetectable by standard medical scanners. A pathogen that also served as a vector for introducing surveillance nanobots into any biological system that came into contact with the bodies. She stopped circling and stood directly in front of Zarath. Every Veltar facility that processed those remains is now under comprehensive human surveillance. We know your base locations, your fleet dispositions, your command structures, your supply lines. We've been watching you build your forces for the campaign against Earth, and we've been making preparations of our own. The implications finally penetrated Zarath's shock-paralyzed consciousness. You used them. You used those species as bait. We used volunteers, Sarah corrected firmly. Every individual who participated in these operations knew the risks and accepted them willingly. They understood that their sacrifice might prevent the extinction of not just their own species, but dozens of others. Her voice took on a quality that made the environmental controls seem inadequate. They died heroes, Commander, fighting to protect their families and their civilizations from a threat they knew was coming. Can you say the same about the Veltar who died in those campaigns? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of security drones moving closer to the confrontation developing on the main floor. The truly elegant part, Sarah continued, is that you've been training our forces for us this entire time. Every tactical manual your people developed, every strategic doctrine they refined, every technological innovation they deployed, it's all been shared with human military analysts in real time. She clasped her hands behind her back again, adopting the pose of a professor delivering a final grade. We now understand Veltar military capabilities better than the Veltar do. We've identified weaknesses in your technology that your own engineers haven't discovered. We've developed countermeasures for weapon systems that haven't even been deployed yet. Her smile was gentle, almost apologetic. In short, Commander, you've spent decades teaching us how to hunt you. The assembly hall had become a tomb of terrified silence. Representatives sat frozen in their environmental chambers, afraid to move or speak, while security drones hovered in formation around the edges of the room. So I'll ask you one final time, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. Did any of them hunt you back? Zarath's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her compound eyes reflecting the chamber's light in thousands of tiny, terrified fragments. Because you see, Commander, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the hunt isn't over. It's just beginning. And this time, you're going to discover what it really means to be prey. The words echoed through the chamber with terrible finality, and in that moment, every representative present understood that the balance of power in the galaxy had just shifted irrevocably. The age of apex predators was over. The age of persistence hunters had begun.